The issues that I'm going to be raising, I'm going to be talking about, has to do with work that I've been doing over quite a long period of time. That has to do with analyzing critically the nature of European thought and behavior. And I have a major work which I hope will one day you will be able to see. It, to me, is very important that we do understand the nature of European culture, because if we don't, then what happens is we don't realize when we are taking on values, behaviors, thought habits or mental habits that indeed come from, not only come from Europe, that's not the point, but which act in the service of European power and which are actually anti-African. So we must identify those so that then we can be cleansed of them. And of course, I am going to spend some time talking about African conceptions and the African worldview, so that we can use these conceptions for the purposes of reconstruction. Let me just say that Brother Inuni said that I had been working in the community for 10 years. He was referring to a particular project, an organization. I've been working in the community much, much longer than that. But there is a particular project that we have, a family that we have called the African Heritage After School Program, which meets twice a week in Harlem. And we have been meeting for 10 years, and that is kind of exciting, the things that go on with these young people. To see them thinking critically and thinking from an African-centered perspective is very exciting. And I would talk to anyone who is interested in starting a similar program. You can talk to me after we speak today. This is working. Okay, so it's very important always when we talk together, when we think, to put our thoughts, our analysis into a frame of reference. One of the problems that we have is there's so much to do. The brother who is in danger of losing his life, of actually being assassinated in Philadelphia, we have to support him. We have to support our children every day who are under threat. We live in constant threat, so what happens is that it takes away sometimes from our ability to conceptualize what it is that we see ourselves as doing. It takes away from our ability to have a plan that goes beyond next week or 2 months. We need to be thinking about where we expect to be in 5 years. We need to be thinking about a 10-year plan, and any plan has to be put into a frame of reference. What is it that we expect to see eventually? And I want to share with you just a couple of quotes from 2 brothers who I believe are doing very important work at this point of giving us clarity as to what are our objectives as Pan-Africanists, African nationalists. The first one is Nationbuilding, is the book by Agyei Akoto, who has been involved in African institution building for over 20 years, has a school in D.C., that is, a group of them have a school that has been in existence for 20 years, an African independent school, which we don't have. a camp, land in Virginia. My daughter has been going to the camp for 6 years now. This is an opportunity for our young people to actually live the kinds of things that we're talking about. So institution building is extremely important, and they do that within the framework of what is called nation building. And I want to read to you from this book, which everybody should get, every African person. I always talk about 2,000 Seasons. Absolutely, you need to read that. The Healers by Agyei Arma. But also now, I would add 2 more books, and one is Nation Building by Agyei Akoto. Let me read this. Nation building is the conscious and focused application of our people's collective resources, energies, and knowledge to the task of liberating and developing the psychic and physical space that we identify as ours. It involves the development of behaviors, values, language, institutions, and physical structures that elucidate our history and culture, concretize and protect the present, and ensure the future identity and independence of the nation. When he uses the term nation, he is referring to the African world nation. You have a building fund. You are participating in the method or the strategy of African institution building. That's what's being done, and that's what we have to do more of. The other book that everyone must read is The African Personality in America by Kobi Kambon, who came here and spoke last spring, I believe. And I just want to read one of his definitions for you and understand what I'm doing. There is a need for us to have clarity. When we talk about culture, we're not just, culture is political. Culture is ideological. And that's what we have to understand, and I believe that these brothers are helping us to do that. Kobi Kambon talks about that objective that we are moving towards as being the creation of the African world order. And I ask you, brothers and sisters, are you ready for power? Because I think that is part of our problem. We really don't know how to deal with power. We've been so used to being dependent and resisting oppression that we don't see that. Why are we doing that? We're doing that because our rightful place is to exercise African power in the world. He said the African world order, a pan-Africanist, nationalist, cultural organization of the world. That's what he means by the African world order. A world organization, a world rather organized around Afrocentric cultural hegemony. A societal organization spanning the whole of the African world, wherein all institutional structures are grounded in and defined by the historical, cultural, and philosophical condition indigenous to African people, protecting and preserving the African survival thrust as the center of reality. So it is with the help of these 2 brothers that I am establishing a frame of reference for our talk today. Nation building is what we need if we are to be able to experience African self-consciousness, which is a concept that Kambon has. Now, I have developed in my work some concepts to help me analyze European culture, thought, and behavior. And I do that because it is my belief that we cannot use European methods of conceiving of reality if indeed we are to, number one, look critically at them, but number 2, to understand ourselves and where we need to be going. So what I've been attempting to do is to reconceptualize, that is to think creatively, using an African frame of reference, using the African worldview. In addition to that, I have attempted to use African words, use terminology that I take from African languages, because I believe that language also is intimately connected to how we think. Language is one of the most important and critical aspects of culture. And so, obviously, we may not be able to immediately take on an African language, but we can begin to do that, because there are things that we have to think about. There are things that we do think about that really cannot be expressed in a European language. And so we are hampered by that language. And we have to do all kinds of things with the language, which we do very creatively. And so I just want to mention very briefly some concepts that I have developed. One thing is people are now referring to the period in which we were kidnapped, raped, taken from the homeland, and then placed into a slave order here in this part of the world. We are referring to that as the Ma'afa. Ma'afa is a Kiswahili term which means great disaster. And I just got to the point I didn't want to be talking about the African Holocaust, as if we're, referring, there's another Holocaust, and then this is ours, and so forth. And I just wanted to get us used to using some African terms. So in Let the Circle Be Unbroken, which is a small book that I do not have with me today, I introduced the term the Ma'afa. So if you hear it, that's what it's referring to. And it's very easy, and we can all do that. We can do it with our children. We can get used to it, okay? Now, M-A-A-F-A. It's very simple, Ma'afa. Another term, asili. I use this as a concept to refer to the germinating seed of culture, of any particular culture. Asili means seed in Kiswahili. It also means origin. It also refers to the nature of a thing, to its essence. And so I use this, the concept was that if you could look at a culture and identify its asili, its seed, then you could understand how everything relates in the culture. So that asili in this sense becomes something like the DNA of a culture. That is, it's a germinating principle. It is a genetic information that once that asili is in place, it will seek to fulfill itself. And everything that the people within the culture create will be in the fulfillment, towards the fulfillment of that asili. Okay? A-S-I-L-I, asili. And I want to show you how it works. I got the opportunity in our session with the youth on Friday to use it with them to show them how they could analyze European behavior. We looked at the New York Times, and there was on the front page the reporting of Bush sending 28,000 troops into Somalia, right? So I said to them, after explaining the concept, we've had a lot of discussion, so they're prepared for this. Why is he doing this? Okay, I said, now suppose he says, we're doing this because we want to help African people, right? So how do you use the concept of asili to help you know why he is doing that? Well, In my analysis of European culture, I've come to the conclusion that the European Asili is based around the pursuit of European power. And what that means is that every single thing that Europeans do is about the achievement of European power, which of course implies the domination of African people and other quote-unquote non-European people, okay, or other majority peoples. So that you look again at that article and you're not confused, because you say, no, Bush couldn't be sending in those troops because he cares about us. He's got to be doing that in the pursuit of European power. That's very simple. But that's what we need. We need something to clarify everything for us, because we get confused. We get the good white people, you see, coming at us and we say, oh, well, that's different. Doesn't fit. But if we use the concept of Asili, we will understand that whatever it is that they are doing, whatever terms they use, however they come at you, you need to be thinking about what? How is this going to facilitate their power and help them to dominate me? Okay, so that's how I have used the concept so that I can then look at various aspects of the culture and show how it all fits. And when I say that, I mean you can explain how their concepts of beauty fit into that. You can explain how their religion, you see, fits into the pursuit of European power. Those are the kinds of things that confuse us. And what I do, because I think it's the most important, you can explain how, or you can see how, academic institutions also exist so that Europeans can control our minds. Do you see? Because very often, usually, we want to keep that separate and say, no, no, that's not about ideology. But it is. Believe me, it is. And that's what I'm trying to show. So that what happens to us is that when we think that we are learning, and we are in these institutions, we are actually kind of taking on European assumptions and presuppositions about the nature of reality. And those are very different from African assumptions and presuppositions about the nature of reality. Presupposition, we only mean that's what happens even before you begin to argue about something. You've got that in place already. We're not aware of what it is that we're picking up from these European conceptions that actually goes against the African spirit. And that's what happens to us in these academic institutions. The academic institutions have been, along with the missionaries and the religion, has been one of the strongest weapons in terms of the destruction, or I should say the colonization of the African mind, okay? And I'm about the work of decolonizing our minds. So, in order to cleanse ourselves, then we've got to know first what it is that we are cleansing ourselves of. We've got to first recognize it. So what I want to do now is to, as quickly as I can, go through some of the more salient aspects of European thought, European conception of reality. And what I'd like to happen is that as I'm speaking, you begin to think well, is there another way to conceive of reality? Okay, because that's what I'm going to be talking about finally, is how do we as African people really relate to the universe? And it's a very different way. To begin with, let's just start. For the European mind, it is very important to make separations between things. A separation, for instance, between spirit and matter, between the mind and the body, between reason and emotion. For the European mind, actually there is no spiritual existence, and let me explain why. You have spirit and you have matter. First, they make these separations. They make them into what I call dichotomies. Those are splits. So you get oppositional pairs between these two things. Now, once they make the split, let's take the one between spirit and matter, then one becomes real for them and the other is unreal. Or one becomes good and the other is bad. One becomes superior and the other is inferior. That is how the European mind works. Why does it work that way? Because it is preparing the world for European power. Because the term that is the superior, the better, the real is supposed to have power over that one which is the opposite, okay? The example of spirit and matter is that matter is real for them. Spirit isn't. So as much as they may sometimes use the word spirit or spirituality, they don't have a clue to what African people are talking about when they talk about spirituality. And what I'm arguing today is that as we begin to take on these concepts, as we think we're becoming more educated, what we're really doing is denying our African spirituality, because then we don't want to believe in it anymore either. Okay? Obviously, male and female. That becomes a value dichotomy for them, where male represents the superior, female is the inferior, and therefore is to be dominated, controlled, oppressed, and so forth. So you see how it works. It has to work that way, because you can't have power over other unless there is an other to have power over. So that what they do is to continually make these splits, these dichotomies, to facilitate that way of thinking. Also, their thinking is very fragmented. Okay, when we get to talk about the African worldview, we will see the difference. I want you to keep these things in mind so that later we can see how they compare. Because one of the things that Kobi Kambon tells us and that we know is that the survival thrust that is inherent in African cosmology and the survival thrust that is inherent in European cosmology or the European worldview, they are opposites. They are contrasting. They are different in such a vital way that our existence here in this place is, we're constantly under threat because we're in an anti-African environment. And that's because of the nature of the European worldview. Its very nature is anti-African. Analysis. That is a method that they use for thinking. All people have to be analytical. We have to be analytical. It's very important. But for them, analysis is the splitting up of things. It is the tearing apart. And so they have to understand everything by tearing it apart. That's the only way that they can relate to things. They can never reach the highest level of thought, which is synthesis. It is when you're able to bring things together as a whole. And that's our legacy. Our ancestral legacy as African people is understanding the whole and how each part relates to it, so that the European mind cannot integrate well. It cannot synthesize. Now, another reason for that is that the way the universe works and that our ancestors understand is that it is rhythm. That it explains to us how the universe is a whole, how things relate to each other, how things are joined. Rhythm is the key. If you can find the rhythm, then you can understand how everything becomes part of everything else. For the European, they have difficulty. They can't deal with the rhythm. So what do? They have to break the rhythm. They have to slow everything down, and that's what they're doing in their form of analysis. Again, if we use their methods, then we're only working with 1/4 of our minds or of our being. We're not using that pineal gland, right? We're not using that spirituality, which really gives you an understanding of cosmic reality and universal reality. Also, what happens from this is that the European needs to separate himself from the universe. Now, I think partly this may be, we can talk about this at another time, but it may be partly because they are actually, in their very being, represent something which is not a part of the natural universe. That is, and so they experience themselves, you see, as being separate from it. But that isolation, that separation between self and other, results in what we call the ego. The ego, which is becomes hardened, becomes defensive, which leads to the concept of individualism. You see, you think of yourself as just being separate, and you're separate from other selves. And in being separate from other selves, you got to compete with them. You got to fight with them. And that's what they're all about. Okay, but some of the other implications of that are, for them, a chronic loneliness and alienation from nature, and alienation from the universe. This is not something that Africans suffered from, you see, when we are in our civilizations. We have to understand that. The concept of objectification. What that says is that in order to know anything, you must separate yourself from it. Now that's what the Greeks talked about, maybe 2,000, whatever years ago. And that has been a consistent assumption in European thought ever since. That is that the universe can be objectified, nature can be objectified, another person can be objectified, and must be if I am to have knowledge of it. Now what I want to show you is how that relates to behavior. Because if you believe that something is an object, then you can do anything to it. You can kill your children because you're not really joined to them, you see, spiritually. Nature you can destroy because nature is an object. So we have to understand that how the conceptualization of reality relates to behavior and encourages a particular kind of behavior. And we've seen that behavior. So in this process also nature becomes desacralized. It is no longer sacred. The human self, of course, is not spirit. It is despiritualized. It is disconnected. The primary reality or the highest form of truth for them is what they call a fact. Now you got to think about that. What is a fact? And we say, well, just give me the facts. The idea of a fact is something which is totally divorced from context. What is context? Context is how we get meaning. If you want to know the meaning of a word or the connotation of a word, you look at a sentence. You see how it's used in a sentence. You do the same thing. You take a sentence and you put it into a paragraph. You're giving it context. Take Africans out of their context and we don't know what's going on. You see? And that's how we're existing. For them, knowledge should not have any meaning. And so they talk about facts as being the highest level of knowledge. That could never be the highest level of knowledge for African people. For us, knowledge has to have meaning. Truth, that is, has to have meaning. The only reality for them is matter. So they exist in a materialized universe which is profane, so that money becomes the symbol of value. It is the symbol of value of things, objects. The concept of time that comes with this European conceptual framework is lineal. It is only lineal. That's all it can be. It is limited in that sense, and it moves along one line. It's unilineal. For us, when we think in terms of lineal time, we're only thinking on a secular level. That's only profane. For us, sacred time is non-lineal time. The Europeans cannot get to that level. So for them, to speak of the past, the present, and the future is to speak of three different things which cannot connect. For us, we live with our ancestors because they're not in the past. You see, they're in a time where we all are together. We can know the future because the future is part of what we are. So we go to our priests and we had readings. That's what we're talking about because we're existing on a sacred level at that time. We still exist in lineal time. You plan for tomorrow when you get up and you go to work and so forth, but that's not all there is. There has to be more. There has to be another level. For the European, there's only that level. That's what we have to understand. It is very limited. What happens also with this, well, of course, for them, there's no ancestral presence. They don't believe in the ancestral presence. As much as they may talk about Columbus or Washington or so forth, they only see that as kind of validating who they are and forcing that into our consciousness. But when we talk about our ancestors, we're talking about a presence that helps to form who we are and helps to form our consciousness. And so what you get from this is an evolutionary, a unilineal, one line, unidirectional evolutionary model. And if you think about it, that's how they teach all history, science, anthropology, and everything. So what they can say is that all of humanity is moving towards civilization. But they haven't reached it yet. But who has reached it? They have. Which means that all differences in culture for them are explained in terms of the fact that these people just haven't gotten to where we are now. We're civilized, they aren't. That comes from, again, that unilineal model. So progress for them is only talking about how you can have technological efficiency, the efficiency of machines. It is only a material concept. They're not talking about how people treat each other. You know, they're not talking about morality. They're not talking about how we regard children, relationships, marriage, anything like that. As long as they can show that we're defeating nature, you know, we're beating nature, you're conquering nature, then for them that's progress. And again, it's that unilineal model where it's got to be getting better and better and better. If we look at our ancient civilizations and we think about some of the knowledge, the wisdom that existed in those civilizations, then you really have to wonder, do people know more now? You see? What also comes from this lineal concept is this idea of, well, their idea of a future is unknown, it's abstract, and it's frightening. And so what they try to do is to predict it as much as possible, and that's what science is about for them, is how they can gain control, you see, of a future that they really don't understand. Because they don't understand time. They don't understand human existence. That's the purpose of European science, is to try to gain a sense of security in a universe that they are not secure in, because they're not at home, you see, with the world. You hear them talking about writing all the time, and writing being the hallmark of civilization. Why do they put so much emphasis on what I call the written or literal modality? That's because, again, they're thinking simplistically. The sense in which they use writing, very different from how our ancestors used writing, which has to do, again, with more than just a profane level. It has to do with symbolism. For them, there's no symbolism in the literal mode. It is simplistic, it is surface, it is superficial, and it is one-dimensional. And it is used, again, to give the illusion of European power. Because then all the books that they have, and they talk about their written law and so forth and so on. But what that's really doing is only, what you can get through their books is only the outer, what we call the exoteric, ex meaning out, okay? And which for us as African people is the least important. The most important is what? The inner. You see, the esoteric. And that you can't get in the way that Europeans use writing. You could get it from our ancient forms of writing and some of the forms of writing that we need to study that exist right now in African cultures. And that ought to be some symbolic systems that are throughout the continent, like Adinkra, for instance. That's just, I'm giving you ones that you may know of, the Adinkra among the Akan people that we find mostly in Ghana. You see the symbols. It's on something. Okay. I knew it had to be somewhere. That's called Jinyame, which represents the omnipotence of the creative principle. Now think about how complex that kind of concept is, you see? And I'm just telling you one. You have the whole system of gold weights, which is so much more than material objects. They represent ideas and thoughts and feelings and the essence of things. So I would suggest anybody who's interested in studying African culture and African thought that you look at these various symbolic systems, which you find in South Africa, East Africa, all over the continent. It is this that the European does not have. You see, and you see how they can take something which is really lacking. They're lacking in things. It's a limitation, and then make it what is the essence, they say, of being civilized. Okay, and really it is what I call reductionist. Their thought is reductionist, and by that I mean it reduces everything to its most superficial level, so that their understanding can't go beyond that level. You see, if you're using these kinds of concepts, so it can never get to the level that we need, because as Africans we need spirit, we need meaning. Their logic, which you've been taught to just revere in your high school and in your college career and so forth, is what we call Aristotelian logic, is very simplistic. It is either or logic based on a law of contradiction. Something is either this or it's that. That is not how reality is. And Africans have understood that there's much more complexity in terms of how you understand things. But again, the European needed to make it very simple, you see, because that's how he could understand. But then he's going to tell us, as we talk, that we're not being logical, you see, using his concept of logic. Okay, again, the concept of progress is anti-nature. It is really concerned with the obliteration of nature. That's what they really are attempting to do. And obviously the laws, the universal laws are saying, you mess with me and you pay a price. And they still don't really understand that. And all this talk that you hear about ecology and so forth is so surface. You know, it doesn't get to the depth of understanding nature. So that relationships for them have always got to be exploitative. always got to be about power or control. So that's the way you relate in human relationships, that's the way you relate to nature, that's the way you relate to your children, and they relate to you, and so forth. Okay? Obviously, from this way of conceiving of reality, what comes is an individualistic ethic, an individualistic sense of self. All of this is very non-African. Competition, and it is all based on the will to power. Now, having said that, and that's just a piece or a tip of the iceberg. I haven't gone into depth in terms of European conceptions, but I wanted to just give us an idea of what we're dealing with, because I really want to focus on us. And I want to focus on the way in which I want to show us how these very concepts have begun to influence how we behave and how we relate to each other, and how we don't relate to the African inner self. Because we are not going to be in a position to build an African nation, to reconstruct and to build an African world order, unless we cleanse ourselves of these anti-African conceptual modalities and beliefs and behaviors. So that I'm saying that we've become, how should I put it, almost contaminated in a sense by them. We have to look at that almost like it's a disease, and so you need healing. And healing can be painful, but you have to do it in order to be able to take the next step. And we've got to recognize that first, you can't be healed if you're pretending you're not sick. Right. And you know, we have to be, given our history here in this part of the world, being taken from the motherland. Let's look at some of the things that happens among us. For one thing, in our organizations, we tend to accept, and really I should also talk about our conferences, I want to talk about that too, but we tend to accept that there's only one way to organize, and that is to have a hierarchical structure where you have a separation from people, and there are people at the top, and it's difficult to get information throughout the organization, and there's a lack of participation of people and so forth. We've got to reconceptualize how we organize ourselves and among ourselves and how we relate to each other. We've got to look at, I'm raising things that probably you've never thought of, but we've got to look at our decision-making procedures, okay? And a lot of this has come to me because of from studying, traveling, talking to people from the continent, who, by the way, are not valuing these things. They're trying very hard to get away from these things so that they can become more European. You know, they'll tell you, well, we don't do things like that anymore, when the very things that they're talking about have this immense value. So it's got to be our role to, as we come to value them, to show our brothers and sisters that they're at the source. You know, we need them to appreciate who they are and who we are. We make decisions in our organizations by voting. What are you doing when you do that? You see, you're dealing with individuals, and you're saying, well, how many individuals feel this way? Then you get a majority, and then you say, well, because the majority of those individuals here feel this way now, then everybody has to do what they say. Believe it or not, this is not the way decisions were usually made, you know, in African civilization. The concept of consensus is what was used and what is used in some still. What does consensus do? It says that if we are a community, if we conjoin spiritually, then we can come to a conclusion which represents who we are as a group and what we're thinking as a collective. You see? That's very, very different. It makes you feel differently about the decision that is reached. I think it's brilliant on the one hand because it reflects a feeling about human interaction. It reflects the importance of the collective. But on the other hand, we see voting as being very efficient. It's quick. Just put up your hand. Who feels this? And so forth. Because what's the objective? The objective is get out of there as fast as you can. Whereas in the African community, the objective is to feel the oneness of the group and not to disrupt that. You don't care what decision. It's not the decision that's so important. It's that the group remains a group and thinks of itself as a collective, and you have people walking around saying, oh no, that's not what I wanted to do. You see? These are some of the things that we have to think about. We have found ourselves becoming, no, let me not say more and more. Let's say, hope we're moving away from it. But involved in, embroiled in egotistical leadership. And I'm submitting that this is because of how we have begun to conceive of who we are. Not only as a people, but as persons. And because, this is deep now, we're running away from the development of the self, the concept of the self, which is so deep in African thought. Then what we end up with is this ego, which becomes very defensive, which sees any kind of criticism, any kind of questioning. All you got to do is question. And suddenly the person's saying, oh, you don't like me. You know, what are you trying to do to me? And then and then the other one is saying something else and so forth. And so what you get is this clash of egos. Okay, or you get, instead of movements which represent the spirit of the people, you get actions which are really just about what a particular ego needs at that particular time to feed on itself. We have to look at that. We have to look at our political behavior now. We have to look at our organizing, our movements, and so forth, and see what's really happening. I want you to use some of these things afterwards and see if you can't see what I'm seeing in another way. The concept of the ego is not an African concept. Okay, it comes out of a very bankrupt, very sick, patriarchal theory of human psychological development. Comes from Freud and people all around Freud, before Freud. Very, very sick. But we accept that and we become embroiled in it, as I said. Okay, where our goal is no longer what is it that the collective needs. And I'm here working for the collective is rather how popular can I look? You know, what's my image? How can I get you know, a large audience to praise me? How can I use the media? How many shows can I get on? You see, and then we find ourselves relating to that. When we see that, oh, that's the leader. No, what we've got to be about has got to be something with much more depth. We also have become involved in controlling relationships with each other, exploitative relationships with each other. These are things that we have got to start looking at. Because we're not talking about taking power and then being or trying to be European. That would be crazy. We're talking about returning to our centers, which is African. We have become very patriarchal. which is totally non-African. I can't tell you how non-African that is. I mean, I don't even think in Diop, in his studies, hit on something which is so deep, so fundamental, and so little understood. I don't even think he understood it. I really don't. But he touched on it, so we should take it from there and then really study it and understand it. And that's when he talked about the matriarchal nature of the Southern Cradle or of African civilization as opposed to the patriarchal nature of Europe. But that what he calls matriarchal, which we could call matrifocal, mother-centered, that's a very, very deep spiritual concept. It goes beyond just talking about women and men. It's very deep, and that's what we need to come back to. But at any rate, I'm saying that now we have accepted a patriarchal model, and because our people in general are not developing themselves, their inner selves, as they should, you get insecurity on the part of our men, who then must express that in terms of a need to dominate women. That's not an African model, because in the African model, there is neither domination of one or the other. We can't function that way. Agyei Armand talks about that. The European feminist movement is about women dominating. You see what I'm saying? Or becoming men, or whatever. It doesn't speak to anything that we need to be talking about, because they have to see things as I dominate you or you dominate me. Whereas for us it doesn't work that way, and we'll see what happens when we come to the African worldview. We have become very materialistic. Very materialistic. Where our goals are all in terms of our material goals, where we're measuring success in terms of material possessions. Even the ideologies that we look to, that we think are revolutionary, hear what I'm saying? Are very materialistic. They're not dealing with spirit. We need an African revolutionary ideology. Do you understand? So that the worth of the person we're now looking at in terms of what they wear and the things they have and how far they have moved up, you know, in this whole system, this goes against the African self. So we're living constantly in contradiction with ourselves. We have done that so much so that there is now among us a devaluation of spiritual life. And by that I mean that we don't see it as being important. Whereas in the African context, it was the most important thing. It was the basis for everything. It doesn't mean that we weren't practical. Doesn't mean that we didn't plan, that we didn't build, but we did that all for a reason, and the reason was a spiritual reason. And so now what we have done is to, in taking that spirituality out of our lives, we end up with a lack of belief. Can't have African people with a lack of belief. Spirit has no place, or the spiritual has no place in our organizations. Think about it. See, I'm talking now about those of us who consider ourselves to be conscious. You see, I'm talking about myself, you, and everybody here. I'm not just here to say, oh, we're doing the right thing and they're doing the wrong thing. I'm saying that there are things that we need to look at that we're not looking at, okay? And that's not always the popular thing to do, but I think it's the important thing to do. We are witnessing violence among ourselves, between ourselves, to a degree that is just almost unimaginable. The way in which we deal with each other with violence. Now, we know that a lot of that comes from a lack of political consciousness. So that, and it comes also from a lack of direction and guidance. So that we will have our youth valuing violence between them. And that will become almost a rite of passage for our male youth. That if you, you know how bad you can be, how much you can destroy another brother, that is the proof of your manhood. Well, I say that really represents our failure to have the structures and the institutions within which they would learn what it really means to be an African man. And at the same time, and this is a little difficult to deal with, I think it is partly a reflection of them being prepared. How many people know what, I will say, Ogun is? What's Ogun? Anybody know? Iron and what else? War. And I believe that Ogun's spirit is here and is in our youth, and that we are unprepared to deal with that. We're unprepared because we're still afraid. And so what we do is we tell our youth, no, that's not the way. And what they do is turn that in on themselves. And so they are very violent towards each other. But there's a place for violence. It's got to be organized, you see. You have to understand what it is that you're all about. We are the ones who are supposed to do that, to understand, to analyze, to have a plan, to have a goal. We're afraid of it. And we're afraid of power, you see. Partly the violence is because of our being separated from each other, being afraid to connect with each other. Again, this is not the African way. This is the European way. It's partly because we no longer feel each other's pain. You see? If you can treat someone like an object, then you can do anything to them. We don't realize that in inflicting pain on a brother or a sister, that we are inflicting pain on ourselves. These are the kinds of things that come with a conception of reality that is anti-African, that is European. And that is what we must cleanse ourselves of. We are not relating to our ancestors as we should. In the African conception, the ancestral being is a part of our being. You hear the youth talking about it in some of the songs now. You see, you got to listen to some of them. And Arrested Development would be one of those groups, right? Here, listen to some of the concepts that they're talking about. But we tend to no longer relate to the ancestral part of ourselves, to our ancestors. We don't understand the cycle of death and rebirth anymore. So we don't deal properly with death. It is very important that when an African person makes the transition from physical existence, that we perform ritual. Funeral ritual is extremely important. Because we don't believe in the ancestors anymore. We don't believe that there's a continued existence on a spiritual level. Then we don't really pay that much attention. You know, we go through the motions, but we don't really believe. If you understand African conceptions, if you understand African conceptions of personal development, of spiritual development and responsibility to the group and so forth, then you have to think, what does it mean if so many of our youth are being killed, assassinated? That is, before they have had an opportunity to go through what is for an African the natural life cycle, to fulfill yourself through marriage and having children, and then becoming an elder. They're cut off at an early point in that development. What happens to them spiritually when they die? Think about it. That's right. So that there are rituals which we must perform for all of those spirits which are not at rest, which are not fixed, you see, so that they can be positive spiritual forces for us, as opposed to continually causing the violence between us, the confusion, and so forth. Now, these are concepts which, if you do not have belief in spirit, they won't sound like anything to you. Sound kind of crazy. But all African people have always believed in the continuity of spirit and in the cycle of death and rebirth. And so, because we're not doing anything doesn't mean that it isn't still a reality. It only means that we are suffering the consequences and we don't even realize why. So that these spirits are, in a sense, interfering with the harmony, you see, of the whole. And then we have these various non-African religions into which we place ourselves, which deny, again, the reality of our ancestors. They deny African spiritual belief, and they demean African culture. Do you understand? We go into these religions, I believe, partly, and I don't know if this has been put to you before, because we are attempting to escape from our responsibility as African people. Because those religions do not teach that we are accountable to our ancestors and have the responsibility to continue the victory which they started. We have the responsibility to do ma'at, to set things in place, to restore the balance. That we cannot pretend that the ma'aba is over. Those religions aren't going to teach you that. But African ancestor communion says that you're responsible for the ancestors, because you are the ancestors and they are you. So that these religions are taking us away from ourselves and teaching us that our brothers and sisters are heathens. And we think, well, they may be, but I'm not. Don't even realize how that doesn't make any sense, because it's really teaching you that you are negative also. But you're trying so hard not to be as you take on what they tell you to do. And of course they tell you that anything to do with African spiritual practice is bad. And that's the very thing that you need, you see, to affirm your spirit and who you are. Rituals for us are no longer important. They are no longer in our lives. Ritual drama is not used among us. Ritual drama has to do with the participation of everybody. You see this audience here, I'm hearing something from you and that makes me happy. I don't want to just see passivity, because that's not the African way. When we get used to, we say we go into the theater. So you're going to see something which is based on a Greek model, right? An Aryan model, where you're not supposed to move, and only the people up there on the stage are supposed to do anything, and that's the same way you're thinking about with your music. You know what I mean? You want to go to a symphony, performance of European music where you better not make a sound. That's not us. And so we can't have our spirit affirmed and energized in that kind of context. We got to begin looking at that. But that's what we want to take on all those kinds of behaviors and feel that we're being more superior when we do that. Learning for us now has become focused only in institutions which we usually do not control. That is, in European academic institutions. So we feel okay because we're sending our child to school and saying that they are learning. They're getting an education. They'll be secure. That's all they need. That isn't an African concept of learning. African concept of learning is holistic and total. And we're just giving up our responsibility. Our concept of learning is not academic. Academic means by definition that it is divorced from life. So that we are neglecting the larger part of our children's development as we become so sold on this idea of school. That's all I have to do is make sure that they go to school. Most of the times we don't even know what's being said to them in those classrooms. But of course, we should know that they're being taught European culture in those classrooms. And what did we say that European culture implied because of the nature of the European assembly? It implies European power. So they are being taught that Europeans should have power over them as they go to school. You see, we have to begin looking at all of this very, very seriously. But you see, once you begin looking at it and understanding it, then with that comes responsibility. And that's what we don't want either. Because ancestors forbid we should have to build our own school. I mean, we can't just imagine of doing something like that ourselves. We've got all the skills, by the way. We have everything that we need to do that. So we got to think, well, why have we stayed away from that so long? Especially in the New York area. Especially. You know, you think of all the talent that you have in New York. Why is it that we don't have independent schools there? We have had some. We should have so many more. And they should have been able to survive. You see what I mean? We should have more now, not less. Think about it. I think it has to do with the mentality. Okay? And then we are buying into this concept of objectivity, which has been used to control us. Oh, I don't want to be emotionally involved. I'm being objective. How in the world can you be objective and be a human being and be an African and you know, live in a culture? How can you be objective? What does that mean? You know, a machine is objective, maybe. See what I'm saying? Or depending on if it's a computer, then it's been programmed by somebody who had a particular perspective on life they had to be, because that's what it means to be human. So we can't buy into that. But we are, to our detriment. We are buying into individualism. Even our concept of family now has become 2 or 3 people. That's right, and we say, okay, I'm doing this for my family. But that is nothing in terms of the African collective. We are separate from each other. We are separate from spirit, and we have an ideology of go for self. Let me make it myself. And that's what our youth are learning, and that's the most detrimental thing to an African consciousness, is individualistic ideology. And we have to look at how much we have accepted that. What that also means is that we have a lack of sense of accountability. You see, we can't blame our children for doing what comes right out of what we're doing. Who are we accountable to? Remember those egotistical leaders I talked about before? You know what our problem is? Who are they accountable to? Nobody. So they decide to do this one day, that the next day, and we just run along and do whatever they say. But you got to think, what is the plan? You know, tell me your plan. And I don't mean for 5 months. I mean, what's your plan? What's your plan for 5 years? What's your life plan? What is your vision of the African victory? That's what you have to ask people. And then you can say to them, well, how does this fit into the plan? Not just what you happen to feel like doing on one particular day. And then take resources from the community to do that. This comes from us buying into the concept of individualism, into egoism, and not feeling that we're accountable to anybody. And then us not having the organizational structures and the institutions which could indeed hold someone accountable. Does not make sense to talk about getting an African person in office in this system here, and then you can't hold them accountable for their behavior. We do that all the time, and we're just happy because, you know, they're African, or they look African. Marriage for us is no longer child-oriented, and that is the purpose of marriage in Africa. Our lives are not committed to our children first. We don't have a priority on children. That's why we don't build schools, by the way, because we don't see these young minds as being the most important thing that we have. We marry for wrong reasons. That goes back to all those other things, materialism and so forth. We involve ourselves in relationships which are not for the nation and not for the community. You see, they're not for the collective. An African-centered relationship should benefit the community. Those are the kinds of things you have to ask yourself when you begin thinking about who you're relating to and so forth. These are hard questions, you see? Because what we're doing is we're getting standards which tell us how to behave. But we're used to living in this society which doesn't hold anybody accountable. So the worst thing for an African person, go for yourself. Whatever makes you happy. There is no longer a development of the self, a concept of how intensely one must work on developing the self. That's work. So again, we want to run away from it. Okay, you don't see on television, they're not telling you develop the self. They're telling you buy this product, buy that product, or this is the way that you should relate to your heroes or whatever, you know. They're telling you what they want you to do. Our elders, because there is no development of self, it is difficult for an elder to be an elder. Let me explain what I mean by that. An elder is not, in the African conception, just a person who is old. Why do I say that? Because what would have been assumed in the African conception is that with that age would have come the experience and the knowledge of the culture, which you could then use to teach others. Now, it's just a matter of getting old. You see, we don't understand the role of an elder. It's a very serious responsibility. And then we don't have the respect for the elders. So you see how those things feed on each other. And now I'm going to deal with something very, hard to talk about in a group and a large audience, but I think it's very important because I want to show you how I'm consistent in everything that I talk about. And I'm doing this because of how much I love African people, and I believe that it's urgent. Brother said earlier, it's urgent. This is urgent. The time is now. We no longer have a spiritual concept of sexuality.
Yes, ma'am.
We see people as sex objects, and therefore they're no longer human. That's not an African concept. Therefore, we engage in what I call profane sex. Let me tell you what I mean by that. There is no sacred concept of the interaction of human beings, so that, and I say this word, sex, is, to me, a European concept. It becomes a commodity. It can be a commodity. It can be bought and sold. We become promiscuous. We have no discretion. We involve ourselves in sexual behavior which expresses only narcissism. Okay? And I may be stepping on people's toes or whatever, but I believe that all of this is a part of nation building. It's got to be. I mean, in Africa, it certainly was.
Accountability all. Yes, ma'am.
In Africa, how you expressed your sexuality was seen as important as how you plowed the fields, as how you organized the warriors to defend the group. It's all, we are whole beings, okay? Narcissism is fixing on and seeing everything in terms of the physical pleasure, or what you think is the physical pleasure of the individual self. That's all it is. We live here in Babylon, in a society which is narcissistic. And I'm saying that we have taken that on. And that accounts for many of the sexual behaviors that people are involved in. Do you understand? And I'm going to show you a very, very different concept. That kind of idea of sex is anti-life, by the way. The African feeling is pro-life. I want you to keep that in mind. You can only get that kind of concept by separating the physical, you see, from the spiritual, and then denying the spiritual. Everything becomes physical. Okay, I'm going to jump to another area, and that is our dependence on Western medicine. And by that I mean, I'm not saying, you don't go to the doctor and so forth and so on. I'm not saying that. I'm saying we have become totally dependent on a particular concept of, I don't want to call it healing because it ain't a concept of healing, right? I don't know what to call it, but in that concept is no idea of prevention. They cannot talk about prevention. They tell you it's prevention, but when you look at what they're talking about early detection. Is that prevention, I ask you? Did you ever think about that? Just finding this disease, in its early stages. That's not prevention. So if you ask them, well, how do I keep myself from getting that? They can't tell you. This was not the African concept of healing. And it comes about, again, because of separation of mind and body, the spiritual and the material. And so what happens within the context of Western medicine is that the symptom is treated, even if it means causing something else, as long as you get rid of whatever that symptom is for that period of time. You haven't gotten to the source of it, it doesn't matter. And that's what we're involved in. So we're involved in just taking a whole lot of pills and artificial synthetic things that obviously are poisonous to the body. So what I'm saying is, you have to understand that most of the physicians that you will go to they haven't learned anything about diet. They don't know anything about nutrition, because that's not what's taught in the medical schools in this country, okay? And of course, spirit for them is unimportant. They don't know anything about the spirit. Now, an African would ask, how in the world could you heal me if you don't know anything about the spirit? You see? But I'm saying, what I'm trying to show you is we don't ask these questions anymore because we've gotten so used to thinking in another being's mind. You see what I'm saying? We're so out of our minds that we don't ask these questions. Doesn't even seem peculiar to us. And of course, we eat any and everything because we've also lost the African concept of wholeness, the wholeness of the person, you see. And in general, we are lacking self-discipline. And I say these things again because you can't blame the children. Because what do they see in us? We have become media dependent.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
We allow ourselves to be attached to the media.
Right.
And that media then, you know, you turn on that TV. Simple little app. Or you push the button now, right? Your psyche is then attacked by what you see on the TV. And we don't look at that at all. We don't monitor that at all. Whatever they show, that's what we see. Those things are affecting us. Those images are affecting us. You say, well, I'm conscious, so it doesn't affect me. That's not true. It means you don't understand the depth of what happens in terms of energy, of vibration, and so forth. Okay? All of these things we need to look at. So that that is what I wanted to give in the little picture of how I see us being affected, contaminated by the European worldview, European conceptions, how they are acting on us. And so you say, well, what do we do? What can we do? There's no reason to feel defeated at all because we have an ancestral legacy. There is the African worldview. There is a whole system of thought that has a profound, embodies a profound concept and understanding of the universe, which our ancestors know, built civilizations on, and we carry little pieces of this in us. So we have a model, and I'm talking about us using the African worldview as a paradigm, as a model for the construction of the African nation. So what I want to do is, I guess it'll have to be briefly, reacquaint us with some aspects of the African worldview. Okay, and again, I'm doing that a little bit in Let the Circle Be Unbroken. For one thing, the African worldview gives us a picture of the unity of the universe, where all things are interrelated and interdependent. There is the idea of wholeness, a holism we get. Also, participation in that universe in a very real way is what happens by virtue of being African and understanding this view. Synthesis becomes very important. Again, wholeness. Intuition is knowledge that comes from within. That doesn't mean that it has no relationship to what is outside of us. But intuition, using that, is the way in which you connect the inner to the outer. And for the African, intuition is extremely important. You see, being involved in what you know is very important, and that's part of what we mean by intuition. What we also mean by intuition is that we believe that there is an ancestral consciousness that exists in all African people, and that what intuition is the tapping into that consciousness so that we are able to get knowledge from the collective, from the ancestral being, which in turn is connected to the universe. You see, it's a very deep kind of concept. But if you talk about science here, they're not going to talk about intuition as being important. In fact, they're going to tell you don't use that. Cut your feelings away. And that's what you're learning in the classroom is get rid of your feelings, your emotions. African's not going to tell you that. You better use that. You see, if you don't know anything, you better use what's in here and learn how to hear it and how to be in tune with it. Our conception of the universe is as of energy and forces interacting with each other, and that we need to understand how those energies and how those forces interact so that we can use them to live a better life, to be a stronger person, to build a stronger community. So that spiritual life and practice for African people, which is much more than what you call religion, spiritual life involves relating to the forces of nature, the forces of the universe, okay? And learning how to open yourself up to those energies. And learning also how to practice the very important principle of the African worldview, reciprocity. How that practice helps keep things in balance so that much of what we do, and you're told these heathen rituals and so forth, is us involving ourselves in a process which is reciprocal with the energies, the Orisha, the Vodun, which can empower us. Now, if we are getting energy from them, we must give energy back, because the African being is very powerful. We're not passive. We participate. We're involved. And that's what we're doing when we give offering. That's what we're doing when we symbolize, when we pour the water, is that we are asking, and so we must give. You see? That concept of reciprocity keeps us from having an exploitative concept of relationship to the universe. Nature in the African view becomes sacred. Nature symbolizes for us the sacred laws and principles of the universe, so that when we see a river and we watch how it works, how it becomes high and low and so forth, we understand that something sacred is being said to us, and that there's a special power that that river has, so we want to relate to that. The earth, the mountains around us, in every birth of a human being, we see something sacred. You see, so you have a whole different sense of how one learns. One learns also from nature. Not also, but very importantly, one learns from nature. Harmony becomes the goal, the harmonious order. We have a concept of the self which is much more expansive than the European concept. It is not a limited ego. Rather, it is a personal self as being expanded to the communal self, which then understands itself as part of the cosmic self. So, in me is the universe. That's what Africans understand. In you is the universe, so that as you come to know self, what are you learning? You're learning the nature of the universe. A Zulu saying says, Umuntu, Ungumuntu, Ungabantu. Anybody can translate that?
Not yet.
Not yet. Well, you will after today. A person is a person because there are people. I repeat it.
Yeah, do it again because he just missed it on the tape. What?
Umuntu. Is he ready? Excellent. Okay. Umuntu, Ungumuntu, Ungabantu. Bantu meaning people. Okay, which is a linguistic term.
Yes, ma'am.
It's not a racial term. A person is a person because there are people. You understand what that means? Okay? So when we tell you that I is we, in the African conception. People aren't just theorizing and speaking abstractly. This is a lived reality, that I am a person only because there are other African people for me to relate to and to affirm me. Do you understand? So that gives us, see how rich this is in terms of us organizing ourselves, reconstructing our communities, and rebuilding an African world order. Human life in the African conception, that is the life of a human being, is a spiritual journey. We have to understand that. We can't avoid that spiritual journey. That's something you got to be involved in because you were born African. It is a process of continual spiritual development. And with that process, as you learn more, then you have a responsibility to teach those who do not know, that is, those who are younger than you. And the culture is organized in such a way that it's guaranteed that you are involved in this learning process. That's what African civilization is all about. They don't take chances with things and say, well, I just hope she turns out right. At every juncture of your life, there are processes that you are going through that are telling you what is the correct way to behave. It's giving you the consciousness of the group. Is making it incumbent upon you to defend the group, you see, and to perpetuate the culture. That's what you're learning. That's not what our children are learning in the schools that we send them to. They are learning how to perpetuate European hegemony, or European control of the world. Now I want to move to the Mawu principle. I call it the Mawu principle. And Mawu is a term that we get from the Fon people, F-O-N, of ancient Dahomey, the Republic of Benin now. I believe that's still the name. Mawu represents wisdom. Spell it. M-A-W-U. The East, the night, the moon, and Mawu is paired with her twin, Lisa, L-I-S-A, and that's in Fon language, and there that represents the male. And Lisa is symbolized by the day, the sun, by heat and work, energy. Mawu reigns at night when one rests. Mawu is forgiving. Lisa is angry. The question becomes which is good and which is bad, which is best, which is superior, which is inferior. And the answer is that neither is, that you need both and both need each other in order for the universe to function.
That's right. That's my...
And I speak now of the Mawu principle as being recognized as an important ingredient in African civilization. We cannot live in denial of that principle. In fact, we don't even understand now the Lisa principle, which would be in terms of the complementary part of that. We are functioning with a European concept of man, of maleness, which is very, very detrimental. And certainly with the European concept of woman, I mean, they don't begin to understand the power of African womanhood. And it's a tremendous mistake, a serious political mistake, ideological mistake for our sisters to be taking leadership from European feminism, who who hasn't got a clue to the depth of African concepts of womanhood. Would never a term from a concept from Kemet, divine motherhood. This is a concept of the legitimizing force in the civilization. That is the sanctioning power for all authority, and that is what a set represents. That is why you see the symbol of the throne with a set. That's the sanctioning power. And of course, Netta gives birth to both male and female. In African cosmology, the concept of the womb is understood as it is nowhere else. The womb is not just a physical organ or has just a physical function. The womb represents creativity. It is an organizing creative principle, an organizing, nurturing principle. It is the organizing, nurturing principle of the universe. That's what the womb represents, and that's why African civilization is matriarchal. That's what Diop was stumbling on that I don't think saw the depth in. And none of us have, as a matter of fact. But there's so much to be discovered as a principle of life, what the womb is. In Africa, you have female associations and male associations. Female associations were not anti-male. You understand what I'm saying? But they were always there. Women always cooperated with each other, helped each other in the market. The market was a place where women were active, where women controlled. This model, though, of the female association and the male association comes from the idea of complementarity and what we call appositional unity. Not oppositional, but appositional. Appositional refers to a pair of things, two things that relate to each other in such a way that each is incomplete without the other, and that both are necessary for the whole. So this concept of appositional unity is one that we need to use in the paradigm that we would use to reconstruct and to rebuild. So that women, in terms of African civilization, were active participants. Girls then must be taught to be responsible. They're taught to be mothers. They're taught to be warriors. They're taught to make decisions. And they are taught to teach. That's a very important point. Young girls are taught to teach because the mother is understood to be the teacher of the young. You've got to think about how powerful this model becomes once we realize it, once we cleanse ourselves of European concepts. Men, of course, are taught to respect women. Men also, in African society, value children. And everybody in the community focuses on the children. Okay, that's something that we have moved away from at our detriment, to our detriment. So the children become central to the entire social organization. The role of the elders is essential. These are those who have already gone through those various processes. And so they are the ultimate teachers and custodians of the wisdom and must pass it on. And then we have Ma'at. Ma'at, as we know, represents truth, justice, righteousness. It also represents the harmonious order of the universe. It also represents the harmonious order within the person who is to be in tune with the universe. And therefore, Ma'at represents for us the highest standards of conduct. The highest standards of conduct. As Africans, you have a responsibility to live the most Ma'atic life that you can. And therefore, you must be self-disciplined. You must live in truth. And you must examine your behavior and your actions and your decisions every day so that you become in the habit of living in truth. And that's an ongoing process. It doesn't end. It just continues. You understand? This came to us from our ancestors, you see, who were in tune with the laws of the universe because of their concepts of spirit and of participating in the universe and of the cosmic self. The continual, ongoing objective for the African person is self-knowledge because of Ma'at. And coming to know the self, one comes to know the universe, and one therefore is able to live correctly. Again, the things that I'm saying to you is not the easy, convenient, narcissistic way to live. But you're living in a society which is based on what is easy, right? What is convenient, the way you eat, what is convenient, and what gives you immediate pleasure. Those are the considerations that you're trained here to look at. I'm talking about something radically different from that. It's not the easy way. It is the best way. And it is the only way that would guarantee our happiness, our health as African people. See, because we're special. We have to understand that. And with that specialness comes responsibility. In African civilization, we have the model of rituals that are there to restore the balance, to restore harmony when things get out of kilter. And they always will, because that is in the nature of human existence. So we have to have something to bring it back into balance. Do you understand? There will be crises in your life. You can bet on it. Question becomes how you deal with it. See? And again, in African society, they didn't just leave it up to you and say, oh, well, go on your own. Become a man on your own. Make that decision on your own. Deal with that passing of a loved one on your own. They didn't do that. They had mechanisms which helped you, as the community helped you, to restore the balance by understanding what was happening. And that's what the rituals were, not some weird occult thing. But they are ways in which African society continually reorders itself and helps the person to understand and put in the proper context what is happening to her or to him. That's what rituals are for. Rituals, they are rituals to resolve conflict. You see, and that's one of our biggest problems right now. All these egos coming into conflict with each other, and there is no mechanism to resolve those conflicts, and there's nobody to hold them accountable and say, no, you can't do this. You're just disrupting the community, and you're just doing this for yourself. But in African civilization, there were rituals to resolve conflicts. Why? Because they did not want the community to be disrupted. Our ancestors were brilliant. They anticipated all of these things. There were rituals for cleansing, because periodically we need to be cleansed. And that's what we've got to be involved in. We really need that. We need to be creating rituals which will help us to cleanse ourselves. Just like your body needs to be cleansed, and you talk about fasting and so forth, which is very important, then you got to understand that also the spirit needs that. The mind needs that. We need that as a community. We need to come together periodically and cleanse ourselves of all those petty things that we think are differences between us, and of all those things that we have taken on from the Europeans without even realizing it, that are getting in the way of us relating to each other. So we need cleansing, healing, rituals. In African civilization, we have concepts of sacred time that go beyond lineal time. Sacred time and sacred space. We have an African term, Hantu, which means sacred time and sacred space. That where we can come into a situation, have an experience, and join with our sacred past. Because we're able to transcend lineal time, which separates past, present, and future, and we experience that all as a whole. We do that in our sacred ceremonies. And if we don't do that, then our psyche is not fed with the kind of experience that we need that keeps us strong and gives us clarity, you see. So we must have experiences which allow us to transcend ordinary, profane reality.
That's Hantu, you said?
Yes, Hantu. I'm just using that term as, it's from Bantu language, to be sacred time and sacred space. Kagame used that term. And then sexuality, which I talked about before. In the African conception, we must also understand sexuality on a metaphysical level, on a spiritual level. We must understand that as the principles of Mawu and Lisa coming together, as the female and the male principles coming together, because through their interaction, through the exchange of their energies, the universe keeps going. Do you understand? And through that exchange of energy, energy is created. It keeps the universe in equilibrium, and harmony is reinforced. You see the level on which I'm talking about sexuality becomes something very different. Becomes life-giving. It is understood as ritual, which strengthens our life force. It is understood as the recreation of being, as an imitation of divine forces. And if we don't understand it that way, then sexual behavior depletes our energy. It takes away from us. It weakens us. If we do understand it this way, then it becomes sacred, it becomes special, and must be shared only in sacred, special circumstance, at sacred, special times. And then the question of meaning. African life cannot be lived without meaning. We can't live that way. And that's what we're trying to do now. And what Kambon calls African self-extension orientation, or the African Asili, what I call the African Asili, must have meaning for existence. There must be meaning in life. We must connect always with the whole, okay, with the one. We have to understand how what we do connects us with the whole. That gives us meaning. The context for us becomes the most important thing. The context becomes most important. It is context that gives you meaning. Nature for us shows us the sacred meanings of the cosmos. We live close to nature. So we have to understand what it means for us to be living only in concrete structures that separate us from the environment. We have to understand what that does to the African being. To live where you don't see the sky. To live where you don't touch the earth. Where you don't have trees around you. We begin thinking a tree is a trivial thing. It isn't. Changes your whole being when you are close to these things, in terms of breathing, oxygen, all kinds of things. I'm saying this to say that as we plan, because remember, we're planning for the African future, then we've got to also think about where we're going to be, what it's going to look like. We have to create our environment. We have to create that environment that is best for African people, and clearly this is not the best environment for African people. So that we understand ourselves as natural beings, we learn by observing nature, we also are able to feel the natural cycles within us, which can only happen as we feel ourselves to be a part of nature. Then you begin listening, you can listen to your heartbeat, you see, and that means something to you. How else can we explain that the Dogon people were able to plot the movement of a star that cannot be seen by the naked eye? Nobody's been able to explain that. They've come up with all kinds of ridiculous explanations, but what bothers them most, that is the Europeans, is how could they do this without us? How could they do this without our system of thinking, which denies totally spirituality? And I'm saying you can only explain it by understanding a spiritual worldview, by understanding the African worldview. Symbolism is extremely important in African thought, in African life. And here I just want to touch on a few things. What we call African art, we're talking about colors. We're talking about, when we talk about music, we talk about dance, what are we talking about? It's energy, vibrations. These are forces that affect us. Remember before I was talking about that attack on the psyche. In African civilization, our ancestors understood very well the power of symbols, the power of imagery, the power of creating something with various materials. That's why the masks were so powerful, because they would be used to make something happen. And we have to understand that. You wear an African print, it not only means something, but it also has power. The various patterns make rhythms. And rhythm is the key to the universe for the African mind, for the African being. Patterns of rhythm. The alternation of colors is rhythm. It's no accident that we all got rhythm. It's because we understand the nature of the universe. And that brings us in tune with the universe, is through our rhythm. You want to learn anything? Figure out the rhythm. Get the rhythm. And you can learn anything. And by that I mean also the pattern. This pattern is rhythm. And then our civilizations were based on a moral order, based on ma'at, so that our cultural values were spiritually sanctioned, and spirituality is culturally sanctioned for us. So it's not like you have a choice whether or not you want to be spiritual. They all come together. Science in the African conception. This is really something that we must retrieve. Science is the organization of knowledge, but it is the organization of knowledge sacredly based. It is the application of knowledge that has been collectively acquired. It is systematic, it must be useful, but for African people, it is the synthesis of cosmic awareness, which leads to intuitive grasp of the empirical, of phenomena, and of the universal whole. So that becomes the scientific objective among African people. Initiation is the learning process. It is the emphasis here on process. What is initiation? It is a way of learning, a method of learning, where the person must commit herself or himself to what it is that she's learning. You can't just go to a class and sit there and take notes, and you don't know the people around you, you don't know the teacher and so forth, and after a few months then you get a grade and you think you've learned something. Not in this concept. In this concept, you are learning the self as you learn the universe, which means that you are learning in a holistic way. That you, through your commitment, through this process of initiation, you are internalizing the knowledge that you're getting. That's when that information becomes knowledge. It's through that internalization. And that's why you hear about initiation processes and stages in African civilization, because it's the process that is important. It's the way in which you are learning that affects you deeply, not just something off the top of your head. In the European conception, you can have a person who goes through all of their schools, reaches their highest levels, becomes a quote-unquote scientist, and then is a moral idiot. Do you understand? Because all of those other things that we take for granted were not being taught in that process. As Africans, it has no meaning. In fact, it's dangerous, right? If you aren't learning yourself at the same time, you're not getting knowledge of self. If you are not having it is the science of the human spirit is what we're talking about here. So that, for instance, among the Akan people, you have the concept of Okra, which is that aspect of the spirit that comes directly from the creative principle. You have the Utoro, which is that aspect of the spirit that comes from the male principle. You have the Moja, which comes directly from the female, and also accounts for how a group, a family is organized. And then you have the Sum Sum, which accounts for the uniqueness, for the unique personality of that human being. All of these together is what makes up the human being. I mean, obviously here we have the basis of a science of the human spirit, an understanding of the human spirit. These are the models that we have to begin looking at in a very serious way. We're going to reconstruct our nation. In the African conception, spirit and matter are joined. Spirit and matter are joined. Spirit is energy. Matter is the form that that energy takes. Spirit is consistent. The material form will change. Right now you are in a particular material form, but that spirit is eternal, you see. Matter is the manifestation of spirit in the African understanding. Spirit is the force. And so the Orisha, the Abasun, which is a Twi word, the Egun, which is, those are the ancestors in Yoruba language, the Nsamanfo, which are the ancestors in Twi language, they are manifestations of spirit. They are the form that spirit takes at a particular time. Shango is a form that spirit takes at a particular time in a particular circumstance for a particular reason. So we have to understand that. And in coming to understand that, we are learning physics as we learn metaphysics. Do you see how much there is in the knowledge of African civilization? Quality of human life has supreme value in African civilization. It is human-oriented. The idea is that human beings need each other. Again, umuntu, ungumuntu, ungabantu. That I am nothing without you. Do you see? And so, I think one of the things that we come to understand that we do run from as we run into these non-African religions is that we are, as African people, are human manifestations of sacred, of divine principles. Again, as African people, we're very special. We are the human manifestation of divine cosmic principles. Now, we can't just pat ourselves on the back, say we're special, because with that comes tremendous responsibility.
Yes, ma'am.
We've been born African. We were chosen to be born African. And that made us the people of nature. We are the people of nature. And we have a responsibility to protect it, to create structures and lifestyles which reflect nature. One of the problems, let me first say that Diop, some of you have been reading Diop, one of the things that he understood was the protective function of culture. One of the problems is that we have not understood that. I'm going to repeat that. Diop calls culture a rampart which protects people. Okay? It gives them a sense of collectivity and helps to protect them from what he called, at one point, I think he talks about cultural assault, that we live in a time of cultural assault. We haven't understood that. Cultural aggression is what he says. We haven't understood that. That has been a weakness of the African worldview, I do believe. In other words, I'm not saying that we shouldn't look critically at the consciousness of our people and our ancestors, because there are things that we know now which should compel us to change. And I'm talking about the problem of African xenophilia. Okay? Europeans are xenophobic, meaning that they have a fear and therefore a hatred of strangers, of anything that's different. Africans are xenophilic. We have an openness, I call it cosmopolitanism. An openness to strangers, And we have an inability to recognize the enemy. Now, this comes from, I think, comes partly from the traditional worldview, but it also comes from what is contemporary African self-hatred on the one hand, and African materialism on the other. And therefore, we either give away our culture or we sell it. It's the most serious political mistake that we are making right now, in 1992. It is worse than it has ever been. And I'm referring, I'm referring to a lot of things, but I think the epitome of it for me is the fact that in Yoruba spiritual practice, organized Yoruba spiritual practice here, right here, in the greater New York area, you might call it, you have what I call wazungus. Okay, wazungu is a Kiswahili term for Europeans. You have, this is a blasphemy. You have the people who are supposed to be most knowledgeable in our culture, our spiritual system, the Babalawo, the various priests and so forth. You have them initiating Europeans. Okay, now that's been going on for some time, so that what we have now is Europeans who are initiating us. And I'm very serious about that. Okay, I think that what we don't understand is that culture is a weapon. We also do not understand that our spiritual practices should be a source for African nation building. We've got to learn to use our spirituality politically. And that has been a weakness of us as a people. So that we think we can make the separation and say, when you question our brothers and sisters who are doing this and engaged in it and just letting anybody in anywhere where we can't go places, right? We can't go to their favorite places. They will tell you this is just religion. Doesn't have anything to do with politics. That's the biggest mistake that we have made. And I believe that these Europeans understand very well that the future kind of locus of our power will be in our spiritual conceptions. And so what they're doing is putting themselves in the way of us getting to them. And we have to hold accountable. Those of us who have the knowledge cannot sell it. And I'm saying specifically, they are selling it. Okay, we cannot allow that anymore. And I don't mean to just start, you start attacking this one and the other one, because it all comes from a lack of organization. It also comes from a lack of understanding that culture is a weapon. The culture is a rampart. That it is our culture that is our strength, so we cannot give that away. And nor can we sell it. You see? Because that's like giving it away. And so finally, I want to just end by reminding you of the definitions or the explanations of nation building. I think I'll just read that one more time. Nation building is the conscious and focused application of our people's collective resources, energies, and knowledge to the task of liberating and developing the psychic and physical space that we identify as ours. That's what nation building is. So it can take place wherever we are. And that we see ourselves not as a small nation state, but as a world nation, and that is the building of the African world order. And I am putting forth to you today that we cannot do that without or until we involve ourselves in a cleansing process and cleanse ourselves of European concepts so that we can embrace the African worldview and use as a foundation, as a paradigm for reconceptualization and for the building of the African world nation, a Sunday Sunday.